From territorial prisons boasting impressive histories and spine-tingling paranormal infestations, to prestigiously unique and infinitely mysterious jails where it's said the ghosts of former inmates are still doing time from beyond the grave. Are you ready for America's most haunted lockups? Number 5. The Squirrel Cage Jail. The Squirrel Cage Jail, located off Pearl Street in Council Bluffs, Iowa, is a museum housed within the historic Pottawatomie County Jail that is one of only 18 jails that was constructed in Rotary style, and the only one of those 18 that stands at 3 stories in height. The jail was first constructed in 1885 over the site of an old church morgue as a squirrel cage jail or rotary jail. That's design was intended to provide maximum security and minimal contact between inmates and jailers. The front of the building was used to house office space, a kitchen, trustee cells, and a quarters for female inmates, while the jail portion of the building held cells like slices of a pie inside of a cylindrical cage on a rotating circle with only one exit. Disturbingly, this system is responsible for countless accidental lost limbs. By the 1950s, the prison's central turntable was beginning to wear down, and it's recorded that it would frequently become lodged in place. In 1960, one such incident resulted in a dead prisoner getting stuck in his cell for 2 days, while others were left to wander the corridors freely. In 1969, the prison closed its doors for good, and in 1971, the property was acquired by the Council Bluffs Park Board for preservation, after members of the Historical Society literally stood their ground in front of bulldozers to save the structure. The Squirrel Cage Jail remains open as a museum to this day, and although the cage no longer turns, tours are widely available, and all cells can still be viewed. In total, there are 4 deaths known to have occurred within the building, being those of 3 inmates and of 1 officer. And, surprisingly, supernatural activity was first reported while the jail was still active. Through the 1950s, one jailer refused to sleep in the 4th floor apartment on behalf of strange scratching noises, footsteps, and the sounds of someone shuffling around while he was alone up there. Reported up into recent times and confined to no area in particular are disembodied voices, footsteps from empty rooms, whispers, and the sounds of doors moving, or of the old cells turning. A number of full-bodied apparitions, those of both guards and prisoners, have been encountered, and several stories tell of something darker that roams at night. A series of investigations have yielded high EMF levels, chilling EVPs, and orbs of light captured in both photographs and video. Lastly, the ghost of jailer Otto Guffith has been identified on the 4th floor, and the spirit of a spectral little girl has been encountered throughout the building, especially within the cells, and has been heard crying or talking from just out of sight. Number 4. The Old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine. The Old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine, located off Newgate Road in East Granby, Connecticut, is a historic former mine and colonial-era prison site that was later turned into the first official state prison facility. In 1705, copper deposits were first discovered throughout the area, and the mine was formed shortly after in 1707. The mine would remain in operation until 1745, after which, through the 1770s, the colony of Connecticut would convert the tunnels for prison use. The lockup would later take its name after London's infamous Newgate Prison. In 1773, the prison's first inmate was committed, but actually managed to escape just a year later in 1774. Through the American Revolution, from 1775 to 1783, the prison was utilized to house loyalists and British POWs. The site would officially become a state prison in 1790, and from then until 1802, construction was started on a number of the above-ground structures that can still be seen to this day. In 1827, the Wethersfield State Prison officially opened its doors, and the remainder of the old lockup's inmates were transferred to this newer facility. Through the mid-19th century, a number of attempts were made to reactivate the old mines, but each was met in failure, and by the 1860s, the site was considered nothing more than a tourist attraction. Today, the old property is owned and managed as a museum by the state of Connecticut. It was closed down for a time from 2009 until 2018 for a series of extensive repairs, modernizations, and renovations. The site is thought to be haunted by restless spirits tied to both the prison and mine's brutal and often tragic past, namely from deaths due to accidents, inhumane treatment, riots, failed escape attempts, disease, and more. One famous failed escape occurred shortly before the prison's closure in 1827, when Abel Starkey fell to his death while attempting to climb a well rope to his freedom. His ghostly scream, followed by a heavy thud, can be heard to this day and has even caused panic among those present. All across the property, many report disembodied footsteps, voices emanating from thin air, strange breezes throughout the tunnels, and the phantom sounds of miners working from just out of sight. Electronic malfunctions through the area are common, and many have experienced abnormal battery death, as well as orbs, mists, and strange forms that appear later in the backgrounds of photographs. Around the old buildings, many describe hearing screams and whispers, and most report feeling as if they're being watched or brushed up against by something unseen. Lastly, full-bodied apparitions ranging from Revolutionary War soldiers to miners, prisoners, and everything in between have been sighted roaming about and have even been known to stalk the living at great length. Number 3. The Amelia Island Museum of History. The Amelia Island Museum of History, located off South 3rd Street in Fernandina Beach on Amelia Island off Florida's east coast, is a history museum housed within the old Nassau County Jail building that offers a wide range of exhibits and educational displays on the area's past. In 1871, land here was obtained for the purpose of creating a standalone jail, which would end up opening later in 1878 as a single-story wooden structure. In 1884, the original jailhouse would be expanded and modified into a 2-story building. A second, newer building was constructed on site in 1891, but was later replaced in 1938 by our current structure. This new building offered vast improvements to cells, plumbing, and cot sizes. In addition to the building in 1954 resulted in space nearly doubling in size to include a number of new offices, guest rooms, lockers, and showers, and inmates were separated by both race and gender. In 1978, a new Nassau County Jail was constructed in Yulee, and the old building was deeded to the Amelia Island Museum of History the following year. The property underwent extensive renovations through the early 2000s, and in 2009 was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The Amelia Island Museum of History remains open to guests to this day, offering tours, museum events, an interactive children's area, and, according to legend, a number of paranormal infestations, with staff and visitors to the museum reporting orbs in the backgrounds of photographs, objects sighted moving on their own, lights flickering with no known cause, and doors opening and closing by themselves. Several have reported hearing blood-curdling screams that seemingly emanate from thin air, or the feeling of being pushed, touched, grabbed, or surrounded by an invisible crowd. A number of reports detail encounters with full-bodied apparitions from both guards and prisoners in old-fashioned uniforms, and several have described run-ins with shadowy figures that seemingly stalk lone wanderers. The site's most famous legend surrounds the story of one Luke Simon Ari, the illegitimate son of pirate Louis Ari. Luke Simon was wanted for many crimes, including robbery, sexual assault, and murder. When he was finally caught, he was sentenced to be hanged at the gallows behind the jail. It's said that a crowd gathered in anticipation of his death, but that Luke Simon, not wanting to give them the satisfaction, attempted to slit his own throat. Astoundingly, staff reached him in time to save him, stitching him back together and covering the stitches by buttoning up his collar before, ironically, walking him right back up to the noose. When the door dropped and the noose tightened, it said Luke Simon's stitches split, and that all in one moment his head was nearly ripped clean from his body, spraying the crowd with blood. Legend furthers to tell that several fainted outright, while others were trampled by the crowd's effort to get away from the literal bloodbath. Ari's spirit has been sighted often near where the old gallows once stood, as well as throughout the rest of the building, usually covered in blood and sporting a gruesome neck wound. Number 2. Wyoming Territorial Prison State Historic Site. Wyoming Territorial Prison State Historic Site, located off Snowy Range Road in Laramie, Wyoming, is a former federal government prison turned state historic site that boasts its reputation as one of the oldest buildings in Wyoming, as well as recognition for holding a number of notable outlaws straight from the Old West, including Butch Cassidy. This lockup was constructed in 1872 and began accepting prisoners just a year later in 1873. The prison was almost immediately hit with a host of problems, with a fire breaking out within the prison's first year of operations, and 11 of its 44 prisoners escaping within its first 730 days. By 1877, the prison had hit capacity, and as it became more crowded, conditions and crime within grew worse, until eventually fewer and fewer prisoners were sent there. Incidentally, a second cell block was constructed in 1889. In 1890, Wyoming would become a state, and plans would be laid for a new facility out of Rawlins. In 1901, transfer of prisoners to the new facility in Rawlins was started, and by 1903, the old prison was finally closed down and was handed off to the University of Wyoming. The university went on to utilize the old property in a series of experiments on livestock breeding until 1989, and in 1991, it was opened up to the general public. In 2004, the grounds were officially established as Wyoming Territorial Prison State Historic Site. The 197-acre site offers a range of restored historic buildings, museum exhibits, nature trails, picnic areas, and much, much more. Unlike other prisons of its day, most inmates at Wyoming Territorial were relatively well taken care of. In-prison crimes were low, and a doctor was always on call to treat any illness or injury. Any of the prison's inmates who became terminally ill, even those with life sentences, were allowed to go home to pass with their families, which also saved the state paying the burial costs. In fact, only one inmate here was ever killed, shot in an attempted escape in 1893. Across prison grounds, many report shadowy figures slinking about, orbs in the backgrounds of photographs, lights turning on and off by themselves, and abnormal battery death. Several who have attempted to spend the night at the prison have described being awakened by a strange dragging sound or the feeling of being watched, touched, or even shaken by a presence unseen. The most famous legend to emerge from Wyoming Territorial surrounds cigar maker Julius Greenwelch. It's said that through the 1890s, Greenwelch visited a local brothel and discovered his wife had been working there in secrecy. In a fit of rage, Greenwelch shot and killed his wife, and in 1897 was sentenced to life. Julius continued to produce cigars while in prison and ended up dying of a heart attack before the facility was closed down. His apparition has been known to manifest often, usually near the area that once held his old cell, but only for seconds before vanishing into thin air. This ghost story furthers to tell that when his cell was removed to make way for displays, activity increased substantially. Some of Greenwelch's most recent feats include stealing personal possessions and leaving them in strange places, filling rooms with the strong aroma of cigar smoke, and opening and closing the cell doors. Number 1. The Museum of Colorado Prisons. The Museum of Colorado Prisons, located off US Highway 50 in Canyon City, Colorado, is a museum housed within a former Colorado Women's Correctional Facility adjacent to the east wall of the Colorado Territorial Correctional Facility. The Colorado Territorial Correctional Facility, which was constructed in 1871, boasts the title of being the oldest prison in the Colorado Department of Corrections system, and was officially listed as a state prison in 1876. The old lockup initially held men, but was occasionally tasked with female inmates. Through the 1880s, however, the prison's female populace rose to a whopping 6, encouraging the construction of a separate cell block to the north in 1884. Progressively, this was actually one of the first states in the West to have a dedicated women's facility. In 1935, the Colorado Women's Correctional Facility opened its own separate building, which shared the Territorial Prison's east wall. The women's building was run more like a hospital ward, with female nurses in place of guards. By the 1960s, the facility had become outdated and was severely overcrowded, and in 1968, transfer of inmates to a newer women's facility was started. The old facility went on to hold protective custody male inmates until 1978, and in 1979 was used for SWAT training, after which it stood vacant for a time. In 1982, groups of local citizens began rallying for the transformation of the old site into a museum, and after extensive fundraising, repairs, and renovations, the museum would open its doors to the public for the first time in 1988. The Museum of Colorado Prisons remains open to this day, offering exhibits on prison history, information on life within the prison system, displays on infamous prisoners, and much more. Some of the site's more perturbing exhibits include the hangman's noose used in the last hanging execution in Colorado, confiscated weaponry, the last gas chamber, and a variety of torturous disciplinary tools. Chillingly, the property is said to be haunted by the spirits of those who were held within: guards, nurses, a handful of inmates from the neighboring facility, and even several additional ghosts who are suspected to have moved in along with the museum's acquisition of historical items shipped from off-site. Stories of supernatural activity within the old facility formed in its early days when the lockup was still in use, with accounts from several guards and inmates telling of the sound of a woman's crying heard emanating from cell 18 while it was completely empty. Up into present time, staff and visitors report a host of activity, including orbs in the backgrounds of photographs, disembodied voices from empty spaces, and the sounds of visitors' names being called out from out of sight. A series of EVPs have been captured in both investigations and by accident, many providing details surrounding actual confirmed former inmates. One notable recording seemingly captures a ghost referring to itself as Shorty that claims to have been hanged by the noose on display. Another calls itself Walter and claims to have murdered 3 children. Disturbingly, a Walter was actually put to death in the gas chamber on display, sadly for the crime of murdering a child. Could he have concealed more victims? Reported across the property are disembodied footsteps, coughing from empty cells, and phantom screams always heard at a distance. The apparition of a woman has been sighted standing in the same spot in the old kitchen, and the spirit of a man in a red shirt and tan pants has been encountered pacing the yard. Several accounts tell of motion sensor lights flicking on when nothing is around them, of old, disconnected heating equipment creaking and moaning as though it's running, and of the constant feeling of being watched or followed, even touched, grabbed, or hit by an invisible and abnormally strong presence. Also reported throughout the old facility are accounts of locked doors found ajar, chained up sections mysteriously unchained, and muddy, bare footprints discovered on freshly cleaned floors. Lastly, the basement is said to hold a malevolent entity, and many who have braved its depths have reported the sounds of something heavy moving just out of sight, chairs and other furniture heard or seen scraping across the floor, and an ominous, inhuman growling from the darkness. Taking into account its absolutely fascinating history, its downright horrifying hauntings, and its long list of associated local legends, we felt there really was no better choice than the Museum of Colorado Prisons as our pick for the most haunted lockup in America. Thank you all for tuning into our list of picks for the most haunted lockups in America. If you enjoyed listening to our histories and ghost stories as much as we enjoyed telling them to you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn notifications on so you know when fresh content is on the way. Throw us a like if you feel we've earned it, and most importantly, share this video and our channel with anyone you think deserves a good scare. We'll see you all next time.